Repeated mourning disaster haunts family. A chilling tale of love, loss, and the supernatural unfolds when Amanda, a young woman, rushes home to see her dying father, Mr. Oldman, one last time. Overwhelmed by guilt for not being by his side sooner, Amanda arrives moments too late, only to witness his passing. As the grieving family prepares for the funeral, unexplainable events begin to occur: whispers in the night, strange noises, and overturned objects. Amanda grows increasingly convinced her father's spirit is trying to communicate. Seeking answers, she consults a local medium and uncovers a horrifying truth: her father's soul is bound to the earthly realm by unresolved regret. As eerie incidents escalate, Amanda is forced to confront her deepest fears in a desperate attempt to bring peace to her father's restless spirit. With themes of love, family, and redemption, this gripping and emotional story blurs the line between the living and the dead, leaving a haunting reminder that some goodbyes are never truly final. Part 1. The final call. The steady hum of machinery reverberated across the factory floor, accompanied by the clink of metal and the dull murmur of workers. Amanda's hands moved in a mechanical rhythm, her focus distant, her mind elsewhere. The air was thick with grease and heat, but the nagging unease in her chest was far more suffocating. She hadn't been able to shake the feeling for weeks. Her father, Mr. Oldman, had been in declining health, though her siblings had always reassured her over the phone. "It's nothing serious," they'd said. "Just old age catching up to him, but Amanda better." A piercing ring broke her trance, and Amanda instinctively reached for her pocket. Her phone screen flashed with James's name, her eldest brother. Her heart skipped a beat. James rarely called during the day, and when he did, it was never good news. With trembling hands, she answered. "James, what's wrong?" There was a pause, heavy with hesitation. Then came his voice, strained and breaking. "Amanda, you need to come home. Dad, he doesn't have much time." Her stomach plummeted. "What? What do you mean?" "He was fine last week, he's not fine anymore," James said softly. "The doctor says he might not make it through the night. He's asking for you. Please, Amanda, hurry." The phone slipped from her grip, clattering onto the metal table. Her coworkers looked over, their faces a mixture of curiosity and concern, but Amanda couldn't speak. The words echoed in her mind, each one sinking deeper into her heart. He might not make it. She picked up the phone, her voice trembling. "I'm coming. Tell him I'm coming," James whispered a quiet "okay" before the line went dead. Amanda didn't waste a second. She approached her supervisor, explaining the situation in a blur of words. The older woman gave her a sympathetic nod. "Go. Don't worry about anything here." Amanda grabbed her bag and rushed out, her legs unsteady beneath her. The factory's cacophony faded behind her as she stumbled onto the street. A few coworkers called after her, but their voices were drowned out by the storm of thoughts raging in her mind. Her father was dying, and she wasn't there. The bus station felt like a maze, her vision swimming as she pushed through the crowd. She purchased her ticket with shaky hands, barely registering the clerk's monotone instructions. The ticket read 7 p.m., but the clock seemed to mock her, moving too slow and too fast all at once. She sat on the hard bench, her hands clenched in her lap. Her thoughts raced, each one darker than the last. What if she didn't make it? What if her father died thinking she didn't care enough to come? When the bus finally arrived, Amanda climbed aboard, sinking into a seat by the window. The vehicle groaned as it pulled away, and she watched the factory town disappear behind her. The journey stretched endlessly, the highway an unbroken ribbon of darkness. The headlights carved fleeting shapes into the night, illuminating the ghosts of trees and shadows of abandoned houses. Amanda's mind drifted to her childhood, memories surfacing like bubbles in murky water. Her father had always been her hero. She remembered the way he'd carry her on his shoulders when she was little, his laughter rumbling like thunder as they played in the yard. He taught her to ride a bike, to stand tall after a fall, and to never give up, no matter how hard life got. And now, he was fading away, and she wasn't there to hold his hand. The bus jolted, pulling her from her thoughts. She checked her watch, it was close to midnight. Her hometown was only a few stops away. Her pulse quickened as the landmarks of her past came into view: the old diner where her family used to eat on weekends, the park where she'd spent lazy summer afternoons. Finally, the bus pulled into the station, and Amanda leaped out, hailing the first taxi she saw. She gave the driver her address, her voice cracking with urgency. The cab sped through the quiet streets, the glow of streetlights flickering like dying embers. Her family home loomed in the distance, its porch light casting a warm, familiar glow. The sight of it made her chest tighten, the weight of reality crashing down. She paid the driver hastily and ran to the front door, her heart pounding like a drum. James opened the door before she could knock. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. "You made it," he said, his voice hoarse. "Where is he?" Amanda asked, her words a whisper. James stepped aside, motioning toward the bedroom at the end of the hall. "He's been waiting for you." The house was eerily quiet, the air heavy with grief. Amanda's other siblings stood in the living room, their faces somber and drawn. No one spoke as she passed, their silence more deafening than any words. Amanda hesitated at the bedroom door. Her hand hovered over the knob, her breathing shallow. She was terrified of what she might find on the other side. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The sight before her made her knees buckle. Mr. Oldman lay on the bed, his frail frame swallowed by the blankets. His once strong hands rested limply on the covers, and his chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths. The oxygen machine beside him hissed softly, its sound an unsettling reminder of his fragility. "Dad," Amanda whispered, rushing to his side. She knelt by the bed, taking his hand in hers. It was cold, his skin paper thin. "I'm here. I'm so sorry it took me so long." His eyelids fluttered open, revealing cloudy eyes that still held a glimmer of recognition. His lips moved, forming words that came out as a faint rasp. "Amanda, you came," he whispered. "Yes, Dad. I'm here," she choked out, tears streaming down her face. A faint smile touched his lips. He exhaled slowly, his chest rising and falling one last time. Then, stillness. The room fell silent. "No," Amanda whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. No, Dad, please, stay with me." Her cries echoed through the house, drawing her siblings into the room. James placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling her gently away. "He waited for you," James said softly, tears streaming down his face. Amanda collapsed into his arms, her body trembling with sobs. The weight of guilt and grief crushed her, suffocating her. She turned to look at her father's still form, her vision blurred by tears. And then, for the briefest moment, she thought she saw his lips move. A chill ran down her spine. She blinked, but the movement was gone. The air in the room grew colder, and Amanda's breath hitched. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but deep down she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Part 2. A Daughter's Goodbye. The night was unnervingly quiet as Amanda's taxi pulled up to the house. The porch light flickered weakly, its glow casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. She paid the driver with shaking hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. Every step toward the door felt heavier, as if unseen hands were pulling her back, warning her not to enter. The door creaked open before she could knock. James stood in the entryway, his face pale and drawn, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion and grief. He didn't say a word he didn't need to. His expression said everything. "You made it," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where is he?" Amanda choked out, her words trembling as much as her hands. James gestured silently toward the back bedroom. The hallway seemed impossibly long, the shadows on the walls twisting and shifting as Amanda walked, her legs shaky and unsteady. The faint hum of the oxygen machine grew louder with each step, the rhythmic sound almost mocking in its monotony. The moment she reached the door, Amanda hesitated. Her hand hovered over the doorknob, her breathing shallow. She knew what waited on the other side, but part of her couldn't bear to face it. The thought of seeing her father, her strong, unshakable father, reduced to fragility and silence was almost too much to handle. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was dimly lit, the single bedside lamp casting a warm but feeble glow. Her father lay motionless on the bed, his chest rising and falling in uneven, shallow breaths. The oxygen mask covered his face, but it was clear even that machine was losing the battle. His face was sunken, his skin pale and almost translucent, like thin parchment stretched too tight. The family gathered around the bed turned to look at her. Their eyes were swollen with tears, their expressions a mix of sorrow and relief. Relief that she was finally here. "Dad," Amanda whispered, her voice breaking as she rushed to his side. She knelt beside the bed, taking his cold, frail hand in hers. "Dad, I'm here. It's me, Amanda." His eyelids fluttered, the milky whites of his eyes barely visible beneath. For a moment it seemed like he recognized her. His lips moved weakly under the mask, forming words she couldn't hear. "I'm here," she repeated, her tears falling onto his hand. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I'm so sorry." The air in the room felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were grieving. Time slowed to a crawl, the seconds dragging out painfully as Amanda clung to her father's hand, willing him to hold on. And then it happened. A long, shuddering breath escaped his lips. His chest rose one final time before falling still. The oxygen machine hissed its useless rhythm, but the body lying before Amanda was lifeless. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then louder, "No. No. Dad, please. Don't leave me." Her cries filled the room, breaking the fragile silence. She shook his hand gently, as if the motion might bring him back, her tears falling in heavy drops onto his lifeless fingers. James moved to her side, his own tears streaking down his face. "Amanda." "He's gone," he said softly, his voice trembling. "No," she screamed, her voice raw with anguish. "He can't be gone. He was waiting for me." Her body crumpled against the bed, her head resting on her father's still chest. She could feel the lingering warmth of his skin, but even that was fading fast. It wasn't fair. She had rushed, given up everything to be here, and still she was too late. The room was eerily quiet, except for Amanda's muffled sobs. The other family members stood in silence, their grief weighing heavily in the air. James placed a hand on Amanda's shoulder, but she shrugged it off, unable to be consoled. "Why didn't anyone tell me sooner?" she demanded, her voice cracking. She looked up at James, her tear-streaked face twisted in a mix of anger and despair. "We didn't want to worry you," he replied, guilt evident in his tone. "We thought there would be more time," Amanda echoed bitterly. "He's gone. There is no more time." James didn't respond, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own guilt. The oppressive silence returned, punctuated only by the faint creaks of the old house. Amanda knelt there for what felt like hours, her hands clutching her father's as if refusing to let go could somehow change reality. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something that made her heart stop. Her father's lips moved. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her rational mind told her it was impossible, that her grief was playing tricks on her. But as she stared, she swore she saw it again, a faint twitch, as if he were trying to speak. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The room grew colder, a sharp chill sweeping through that made Amanda shiver. The faint scent of her father's cologne lingered in the air, stronger than it should have been. The shadows on the walls seemed to shift, pressing closer as if the room itself were alive. "Did anyone else see that?" Amanda asked, her voice trembling. James shook his head. "See what?" His lips. "They moved," she said, her eyes wide and unblinking. James exchanged a glance with one of their sisters, both of them wearing identical expressions of pity. "Amanda, you're exhausted. You've been through a lot tonight." But Amanda wasn't convinced. She turned back to her father's face, her heart pounding. His expression was unchanged, the stillness of death now settling over his features. And yet, the chill in the room remained. Amanda stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows growing darker, deeper. Something about the air had changed. It felt heavier, oppressive, almost suffocating. Her mother approached, wrapping an arm around Amanda's shoulders. "Sweetheart, come on. Let's give him some peace." Reluctantly, Amanda allowed herself to be guided out of the room. But as she reached the doorway, she couldn't resist looking back. Her father's face stared back at her, motionless and serene. Yet the feeling of being watched sent a shiver down her spine. As the family gathered in the living room to console one another, Amanda sat apart, her mind racing. The memory of her father's lips moving played over and over in her mind, each time more vivid than the last. Was it a trick of the light? Her grief clouding her perception? Or was it something else? The thought sent a chill through her, but she couldn't shake it. Deep down, Amanda felt it in her bones this wasn't the end. Something was still waiting in the shadows, lingering, watching, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Part 3. Unrest in the shadows. The days following Mr. Oldman's passing were a blur of grief and exhaustion. The house was filled with the hushed murmurs of relatives, the occasional clink of dishes in the kitchen, and the faint scent of incense wafting through the air. Yet, amidst the rituals and preparations for the funeral, something darker lingered in the corners of the Oldman family home, a presence that Amanda couldn't ignore. On the first night after her father's death, Amanda lay awake in the small guest room she had used during her childhood visits. The house, usually a place of warmth and nostalgia, now felt unfamiliar, as if it had been drained of its comforting essence. The wind howled softly outside, but it was the silence inside that unsettled her. As she stared at the ceiling, trying to push away the events of the past 2 days, Amanda heard it for the first time, a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was one of her siblings in the hallway. She sat up, straining to hear. Amanda. The sound was barely audible, a breath against her ear. Her skin prickled with goosebumps, and she froze in place. Hello, she called out softly, her voice trembling. No response. She forced herself out of bed, her heart pounding as she opened the door and peeked into the dark hallway. It was empty, the only light coming from the flickering bulb near the stairs. Amanda shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease that crawled up her spine. It's just grief, she muttered to herself. I'm tired, but the whisper stayed with her, lingering in the back of her mind like a forgotten melody. The next morning, the family gathered in the living room to finalize funeral arrangements. Amanda sat quietly, her eyes fixed on a steaming cup of tea that had gone untouched. Her siblings were discussing logistics, flowers, catering, transportation, but Amanda couldn't focus. She felt a chill, like an unseen hand brushing against her neck. The coldness wasn't new. Ever since her father's passing, the house seemed colder than it should be, even with the heater running. Amanda wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, trying to shake the feeling, but it clung to her like a shadow. Hey, Amanda, James's voice broke through her thoughts. Huh, she asked, startled. We need you to help sort through Dad's things later, he said gently. Sure, she murmured, though her mind was elsewhere. That afternoon, while sorting through her father's belongings in his bedroom, Amanda felt the chill intensify. She carefully folded his shirts, her fingers lingering on the fabric that still carried traces of his scent. Tears welled in her eyes, but before they could fall, she felt it again, a presence. It wasn't just cold anymore. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the room itself was alive. The faint hum of the oxygen machine, which had been turned off days ago, seemed to echo in her ears. She turned quickly, her breath hitching. Nothing. The room was empty, but Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Her gaze fell on the old rocking chair in the corner. It had been her father's favorite spot, where he would sit and read or simply stare out the window. Now, it stood still, but Amanda's heart skipped a beat when she noticed the faint impression of a figure on the cushion. It was as if someone had just risen from the chair. She stepped closer, her hands trembling. Dad, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The chair creaked. Amanda stumbled back, her heart racing. Her mind scrambled for a rational explanation, but deep down, she knew what she had felt, what she had seen. By the second night, the whispers grew louder. They weren't constant, but they came when Amanda was alone, soft, mournful murmurs that carried no clear words, only the weight of sorrow. At dinner, she tried to bring it up. Has anyone heard anything strange? She asked hesitantly, looking around the table. James frowned. Strange? Like what? Whispers? Or I don't know, just something that doesn't feel right, Amanda said, her voice trailing off. Her siblings exchanged glances. Amanda, it's probably just the stress, James said. We're all on edge, I know what I heard, Amanda insisted, her voice firmer now. Grief does weird things to people, her sister chimed in, her tone meant to be comforting but coming off dismissive. Amanda didn't argue further, but she couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in her chest. The strangest occurrence happened on the third day. It was early evening, and Amanda was in the kitchen, washing dishes. The room was quiet, except for the gentle clatter of plates and the rush of water. She had just finished rinsing a glass when she heard a loud crash behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The family altar, which had been carefully set up with her father's photo, incense, and offerings, had toppled over. Oh my God, she whispered, rushing to pick it up. The framed photo of her father lay face down, its glass cracked. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, staring into his eyes, frozen in the photograph's smile. A chill swept through the room, so sharp and sudden that Amanda gasped. Behind her, the faucet turned on by itself. Amanda whipped around, staring in disbelief as water gushed from the sink. She rushed to turn it off, her breath coming in short gasps. This isn't real, she whispered to herself. This isn't happening, but deep down, she knew it was. That night, Amanda couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart racing with every creak and groan of the house. The whispers came again, louder this time, circling her like a faint breeze. Amanda, she sat up, clutching the blanket to her chest. Who's there, she demanded, her voice trembling. The room fell silent. Amanda's eyes darted to the window, then to the door. She felt trapped, like a caged animal waiting for the predator to strike. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and her breath became visible in the cold. The closet door creaked open. Amanda's heart stopped. She stared at the dark gap, her pulse pounding in her ears. Slowly, she slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the icy floor. Dad, she whispered, inching closer. The air grew heavier with each step. Amanda reached out, her hand trembling as she pushed the door open further. The closet was empty, but the cold remained, seeping into her skin. Then, she heard it, a faint, guttural sigh, coming from right behind her. Amanda spun around, her scream caught in her throat. The room was empty, but the overwhelming sense of being watched made her knees weak. She collapsed onto the bed, clutching her knees to her chest, tears streaming down her face. Please, she whispered into the darkness. If you're here, if it's really you, just tell me. The whisper stopped. The house fell into an eerie silence, but Amanda knew it wasn't over. Whatever was haunting her wasn't done yet. Part 4. The whispered plea. The air in the Oldman family home was heavy with grief. But for Amanda, there was something darker lurking beneath the sadness. The days following her father's death had been filled with unsettling whispers and inexplicable chills. But it wasn't until that particular night that the true weight of the unknown pressed down on her. It was past midnight, and the house was deathly quiet. Amanda lay in her bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, her mind too restless for sleep. The faint sound of the wind outside only added to the eerie silence within the house. She shifted under the blankets, trying to push aside the unease that had plagued her for days. Then, it came. At first, it was faint, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the murmur of distant voices. Amanda froze, her heart pounding. She strained her ears, convinced it was her imagination. But then she heard it again, louder this time, clearer. Amanda, her father's voice. Her body stiffened, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible. She had watched him take his last breath, had felt the stillness of his hand in hers. Yet, the voice was unmistakable. Amanda. It was coming from the hallway. Amanda's throat went dry. Every instinct screamed for her to stay in bed, to pull the covers over her head and pretend she hadn't heard anything. But a stronger force, a mix of curiosity and dread, compelled her to move. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the icy floor sending a shiver up her spine. Her feet felt like lead as she crept toward the door, her heart hammering so loudly she feared it might drown out the voice. The hallway stretched before her, bathed in the dim glow of a single flickering bulb. Shadows danced along the walls, creating grotesque shapes that made her stomach churn. "Dad," she called out, her voice trembling. No response. Taking a deep breath, Amanda stepped into the hallway. The air was cold, unnaturally so, and carried the faint scent of her father's cologne. She wrapped her arms around herself, her fingers brushing against the goosebumps on her skin. "Is anyone there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. A faint creak echoed behind her, and she spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, its hinges groaning as it swung back and forth. Her father's voice came again, clearer this time. "Amanda. Come here," her breath hitched. She took a hesitant step forward, her knees weak and unsteady. The voice seemed to pull her, drawing her toward the living room like an invisible thread. When she pushed the door open, the sight that greeted her made her blood run cold. The family altar, which had been meticulously set up in her father's honor, was overturned. The offerings were scattered across the floor. Incense sticks snapped in half, and the small bowl of rice lay in pieces. But what drew Amanda's attention most was her father's photograph. It had fallen face down, its glass frame shattered. She knelt slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the photo. Her fingers brushed against the shards of glass as she picked it up. The once smiling image of her father now seemed to gaze at her with a hollow sadness, the crack in the glass splitting his face in two. "Dad," Amanda whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Is this you?" A sudden gust of wind swept through the room, though the windows were closed. The candles on the altar flickered wildly before going out, plunging the room into darkness. Amanda gasped, clutching the photograph to her chest. She stumbled back, her mind racing. "This isn't real," she muttered. "This can't be real," but deep down she knew it was. The silence that followed was suffocating, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Amanda felt a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. It pressed against her, heavy and cold, filling her with an overwhelming sense of sorrow and dread. And then, the voice returned. "Amanda." It was louder now, more insistent. "Dad, what do you want?" she cried, her voice breaking. "Why are you doing this?" The temperature in the room plummeted further, and Amanda's breath came out in visible puffs. Her hands shook so violently that the photograph slipped from her grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Suddenly she felt a pressure on her shoulder, light, but unmistakable. It was as if someone had placed a hand there, a touch both familiar and foreign. She spun around, but the room was empty. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "If this is you, tell me what you want. I'll do anything. Just stop." The air grew still, and for a moment, Amanda thought it was over. But then she heard it again, a sound that made her stomach twist in terror. It was a sigh, low and mournful, followed by a single word. "Help." Amanda's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her father's voice was filled with pain, with longing, and it broke something deep inside her. "I don't understand," she sobbed. "What do you need me to do? Tell me." But no answer came. The room remained cold and silent, the oppressive presence lingering like a shadow. Amanda sat there for what felt like hours, clutching the photograph and staring at the overturned altar. When she finally gathered the courage to stand, her resolve hardened. She couldn't ignore the signs any longer. Her father's spirit was still here, and he was trying to tell her something. She set the photograph back on the altar, her hand steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. The glass was broken, but she didn't care. As she lit a fresh stick of incense, she whispered, "I'll figure it out, Dad. I promise." The candle flame flickered softly, and for a moment, Amanda thought she felt the faintest warmth brush against her cheek, like a fleeting kiss goodbye. But the shadows in the corners of the room remained, watching, waiting. And Amanda knew this was only the beginning. Part 5. Seeking answers. The days after the incident with the altar were a blur of restless nights and oppressive dread. Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that her father was trying to reach her. But for what purpose? She didn't know. The whispers, the chill in the air, the overturned photograph, it all pointed to something unresolved, something that tethered his spirit to the world of the living. Her siblings had dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to grief and exhaustion. "You're imagining things," James had said. "This isn't good for you, Amanda. You need to rest," but Amanda couldn't rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard his voice pleading, faint but unmistakable. By the fourth night, she couldn't take it anymore. The fear, the guilt, the unanswered questions, they gnawed at her, refusing to let her breathe. She needed help, and there was only one person she could think of who might provide answers. The medium lived in a small, unassuming house on the edge of town, surrounded by a wild, overgrown garden. The windows were dark, and the peeling paint on the door gave the place an air of abandonment. Amanda hesitated at the gate, her heart racing. She had never believed in such things: ghosts, spirits, mediums. They were stories told to frighten children, tales spun to explain the unexplainable. Yet here she was, desperate enough to seek out answers in the shadows of superstition. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the gate, the rusty hinges screeching in protest. She walked up the cracked stone path and knocked on the door, her knuckles trembling against the wood. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the faint sound of footsteps approached, slow and deliberate. The door creaked open, revealing a woman in her 60s, her face lined with years of wisdom and weariness. Her piercing gray eyes seemed to look straight through Amanda. "You've been carrying something heavy," the woman said before Amanda could speak. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Come in." Amanda followed her inside, the air thick with the scent of herbs and candle wax. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, books, and strange trinkets. A small table in the center of the room held a single candle, its flame flickering unnaturally despite the stillness of the air. The woman motioned for Amanda to sit. "My name is Miriam," she said, taking a seat across from her. "Tell me why you're here." Amanda hesitated, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. I think my father's spirit is still here," she began. "He passed away a few days ago, but strange things have been happening. I hear his voice calling me. I feel cold spots in the house. His photograph was knocked over, and the altar was disturbed. It's like he's trying to tell me something, but I don't know what." Miriam nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Amanda's face. "And how did your father die?" "He was sick," Amanda replied, her voice breaking. "It was his lungs. He refused treatment because he didn't want to burden us with the cost. He said it was better this way." But she trailed off, the weight of her guilt pressing down on her chest. "You feel responsible," Miriam said, her tone matter of fact. Amanda looked up, startled. "How did you—" "It's written all over you," Miriam interrupted gently. "But guilt is not why you're here. You're here because you believe there's something unfinished, something holding your father back." Amanda nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I just want to help him. If he's suffering, I need to know why. I need to know what I can do." Miriam leaned back in her chair, her expression contemplative. "Spirits linger for many reasons: love, regret, anger, fear. But from what you've told me, your father's soul is bound by regret. His sacrifice, though noble, came at a cost to his peace." Amanda's breath caught in her throat. "What does that mean? Is he trapped?" Miriam nodded solemnly. "His refusal to seek treatment, his decision to prioritize you and your siblings over his own life, these choices were made out of love. But love can be a chain as much as it is a comfort. His spirit remains tethered because he feels his death left something undone, unresolved." Amanda's tears spilled over. "What can I do to help him?" Miriam reached for a small box on the shelf behind her. She opened it, revealing a bundle of dried herbs, a candle, and a small vial of oil. "There's a ritual," she said. "It's simple, but it requires your full commitment. You must speak to him, acknowledge his sacrifice, and release him from his guilt. Only then can he move on." Amanda's hand shook as she took the items. "Will this really work if your heart is true?" "It will," Miriam said. "But be warned, spirits bound by regret can be unpredictable. You must be prepared for whatever happens." The cryptic warning sent a chill through Amanda, but she nodded. "I'll do it. I'll do whatever it takes." That night, Amanda waited until the house was quiet. Her siblings had gone to bed, and the only sound was the faint creak of the old wooden beams. She set up the ritual in the living room, lighting the candle and placing her father's photograph at the center of the altar. The herbs crackled faintly as she burned them, filling the air with a pungent, earthy scent. She knelt before the altar, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling. "If you're here, please listen to me. I know you stayed for us for me. I know you didn't want to burden us, but your choice had broke us. I wish I could have done more, could have convinced you to fight." Her voice cracked, and she wiped away a tear. "But I understand why you did it. You loved us so much and you gave everything for us. You don't have to stay anymore, Dad. We'll be okay. I'll be okay. Please, rest now. Be free." The flame on the candle flickered violently, and a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the fire. Amanda gasped, her eyes darting to the photograph. For a moment, she thought she saw her father's reflection in the glass, not the sick, frail man she had said goodbye to, but the strong, vibrant father she remembered from her childhood. His lips moved, and though no sound came, Amanda knew what he was saying. "Thank you." The photograph fell forward, and the chill in the room dissipated. The weight that had pressed against Amanda's chest lifted, replaced by a sense of warmth and peace. She sank back onto her heels, her tears flowing freely. For the first time since his death, she felt like her father was truly at rest. Part 6. The Funeral's Curse. The morning of Mr. Oldman's funeral arrived, cloaked in an ominous stillness that unsettled everyone in the house. The air was thick with an almost tangible weight, as though the world itself mourned alongside the grieving family. Amanda awoke to the sound of distant thunder, though the sky outside her window remained a dull, overcast gray. She dressed in a black dress her father had once complimented years ago, her hands trembling as she buttoned it. The night before, she had barely slept. The lingering whispers, the eerie coldness that seemed to follow her, and the medium's cryptic warning all churned in her mind. Despite her attempts to reassure herself, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be anything but ordinary. As the family gathered in the living room, Amanda noticed the nervous glances her siblings exchanged. Even James, usually the pillar of strength, looked uneasy. The family priest, Father Callahan, arrived shortly before the hearse, his usually calm demeanor replaced by an almost imperceptible tension. "We're ready," he said quietly, though his eyes betrayed his unease. The procession begins. The funeral procession moves slowly through the town, the hearse leading the way with the family cars trailing behind. A light drizzle began to fall, soft and unassuming at first, but Amanda couldn't ignore the chill it brought. The raindrops on the car windows blurred the view outside, creating a distorted, dreamlike quality to the landscape. As they approached the cemetery, the drizzle turned into a downpour. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing louder with each passing moment. Amanda glanced at James, who gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. "This storm wasn't in the forecast," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding rain. Amanda didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was more than just bad weather. When they arrived at the cemetery, the family huddled under umbrellas as they followed the pallbearers carrying Mr. Oldman's casket. The rain seemed relentless, soaking through their shoes and chilling them to the bone. The wind howled through the trees, causing the branches to sway violently, their skeletal forms casting eerie shadows across the graves. The ceremonial candles that lined the path to the burial site flickered wildly, struggling against the wind. Father Callahan's voice trembled as he began the rites, the Latin prayers barely audible over the storm. Then, the first candle went out. Amanda's heart sank as she watched the tiny flame flicker and die, leaving a plume of smoke that twisted unnaturally in the wind. A second candle followed, then a third, until all the flames were extinguished, leaving the path in darkness. "It's just the wind," someone whispered, but their voice lacked conviction. Amanda's gaze darted to her father's casket. The rain pounding against its polished surface seemed to intensify, each droplet echoing in her ears like a drumbeat. The ground beneath her feet felt unsteady, as if the earth itself was shifting. The thunderous omen. As Father Callahan continued his prayers, A deafening clap of thunder shook the ground. Several mourners gasped, clutching at one another for support. Amanda's legs nearly gave out as she felt the vibration travel up her body, rattling her bones. The priest paused, his voice faltering. He glanced at the casket, then at Amanda, his expression unreadable but filled with a quiet dread. Amanda took a step forward, her breath hitching as the wind seemed to swirl around her. She felt it again, that cold, suffocating presence she had come to know so well. It pressed against her chest, filling her with a mix of sorrow and fear. "Dad," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The rain suddenly stopped, as if silenced by an unseen hand. The abrupt stillness was even more unsettling than the storm. Amanda's heart pounded as she stared at the casket, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence was broken by a low, guttural sound, a groan that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The mourners froze, their eyes wide with terror. What was that? Someone whispered. Before anyone could respond, the ground near the casket cracked. It wasn't large, just a small fissure, but the sight of it sent a ripple of panic through the crowd. Father Callahan stepped back, clutching his cross tightly. His lips moved in silent prayer, but the words seemed to falter, his faith tested by the unnatural events unfolding before him. The lingering spirit. Amanda's eyes were fixed on the casket, her hands trembling at her sides. She felt a pull, as though something unseen was drawing her closer. Ignoring the murmurs and protests of the other mourners, she stepped forward, her feet sinking into the muddy ground. "Dad," she said again, louder this time. "If you're here, please, let me help you." "What do you need?" The air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeped into her bones and made her teeth chatter. The shadows around the burial site seemed to deepen, curling like smoke around the mourners. Amanda felt a presence behind her, a faint, almost imperceptible touch on her shoulder. She turned quickly, but no one was there. Her breath came in short, panicked bursts as she turned back to the casket. The fissure in the ground widened slightly, and for a moment, Amanda thought she saw something, a faint glow, like the flicker of a distant light, emanating from the crack. "Stop!" Father Callahan's voice rang out, breaking through the tension. He stepped forward, his cross held high. "This is not a place for the living to intervene. We must let him go." Amanda turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "He's not at peace," she said, her voice breaking. "I can feel it. He's still here, whatever binds him. It is not for you to fix," the priest replied, though his voice lacked its usual authority. The wind picked up again, howling through the cemetery like a mournful wail. The faint glow from the fissure grew brighter, pulsing in time with Amanda's racing heart. She clenched her fists, her body trembling. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I couldn't do more for you. But I'm here now, Dad. I'm here for a moment." Everything stopped, the wind, the whispers, even the rain. The world seemed to hold its breath as Amanda's words hung in the air. And then, she felt it, a warmth, fleeting but undeniable, brushing against her cheek like a final goodbye. The fissure in the ground slowly closed, the light fading into nothingness. The candles relit themselves, their flame steady and unwavering. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a quiet stillness that felt almost serene. Father Callahan exhaled shakily, lowering his cross. "It's done," he said softly. The aftermath. As the mourners dispersed, their faces pale and somber, Amanda lingered by the gravesite. She stared at the freshly turned earth, her chest heavy with a mix of relief and sorrow. James approached, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Amanda nodded, though she wasn't sure if it was true. "I think he's at peace now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. James didn't respond, but he gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze before walking away. Amanda stayed a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the grave. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. "I love you." As she turned to leave, she thought she heard a faint voice carried on the wind, a whisper of gratitude, soft but unmistakable. And for the first time in days, Amanda felt a sense of peace. Part 7. A Daughter's Redemption. The house was quiet that evening, quieter than it had been since the day her father passed. The usual murmurs of her siblings, the hum of background conversations, even the soft creaks of the old wooden floors, all were absent. It was as if the house itself had paused, waiting for something unspoken to unfold. Amanda sat in the corner of the dimly lit living room, her gaze fixed on the family altar. Her father's photograph stood in the center, framed by fresh flowers and offerings of fruit and tea. The faint scent of incense from earlier lingered in the air, mixing with the soft aroma of rain that still clung to her clothes. She had avoided the altar for days, unable to face the weight of her guilt. But tonight, something within her shifted. The events at the funeral, the storm, the flickering lights, the fissure in the earth had left her shaken, but also resolute. Her father's spirit had been there, lingering, and Amanda could no longer deny what she had known deep in her heart. He wasn't at peace, and it was her fault. Facing the altar, Amanda rose slowly, her legs heavy, as though the air around her had thickened. Her footsteps were soft but deliberate as she approached the altar. The flickering light of a single candle cast shadows across the room, the flame seeming to dance in time with the pounding of her heart. She knelt before the altar, her knees pressing into the worn wooden floor. For a moment, she simply stared at her father's photograph, her vision blurring with unshed tears. His smile in the picture was kind, warm, the smile of a man who had carried the weight of the world on his shoulders but never let it show. "I'm so sorry, Dad," Amanda whispered, her voice trembling. Her hands reached for the incense sticks on the altar. She lit one with the candle's flame, the smoke curling upward in delicate spirals. The room seemed to darken as the incense burned, the shadows growing deeper, more intimate, as if they were leaning in to listen. Amanda bowed her head, clasping her hands together in a silent prayer before she began to speak. The apology. "Dad," she started, her voice breaking. "I know you're still here. I've felt you. I've heard you. I know you've been trying to reach me." A tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto the wooden floor beneath her. She didn't bother wiping it away. "I'm sorry I wasn't there for you when you needed me most," she continued. "I should have been home sooner. I should have seen how much you were struggling. You tried so hard to protect us, to make sure we didn't worry, but I should have known." Her words came faster now, tumbling over one another as if they had been held back for too long. "You sacrificed everything for us. You gave up your treatments, your health, just so we wouldn't have to carry the burden. But it wasn't fair, Dad. It wasn't fair to you. You deserve better. You deserve more time." The incense smoke curled and twisted in the air, forming shapes Amanda couldn't quite discern. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. "I've carried so much guilt since you left," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been angry at myself, at the world, even at you. But I understand now. I understand why you made the choices you did. You did it because you loved us." Her hands tightened into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "But you don't have to stay here anymore. You don't have to keep watching over us, worrying about us. We'll be okay. I promise we'll be okay." The flicker of light. As Amanda finished speaking, the candle flame flickered violently, as though caught in an invisible breeze. She gasped, her eyes darting to the photograph on the altar. For a moment, it seemed as though her father's face had changed. The warmth in his smile now carried something else, something deeper. Gratitude, perhaps. The room grew colder, but it wasn't the oppressive chill Amanda had felt before. This cold was different, soft, gentle, almost comforting. She felt it wrap around her like a familiar embrace, the kind her father used to give when she was a little girl. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. The candle flame steadied, burning brighter than it had before. The warmth returned to the room, spreading from the altar and filling the space around her. Amanda closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. In the silence, she thought she heard his voice. It wasn't loud or distinct, but a faint whisper carried on the air. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. It was forgiving, loving. Amanda's tears flowed freely now, her shoulders shaking with the force of her sobs. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for everything. I love you, Dad." "I'll always love you." The warmth lingered for a moment longer before fading, leaving behind a sense of calm Amanda hadn't felt in days. She opened her eyes, her gaze falling once again on the photograph. It looked the same as before, yet somehow different. "I think he heard me," she said softly, the realization settling over her like a blanket. The final sign. As Amanda rose to her feet, the shadows in the room seemed to recede, retreating to their corners. The candle burned steadily, its light casting a gentle glow over the altar. But just as she turned to leave, something caught her attention. A single flower, a white lily from the offerings, had fallen from its place. It rested at the base of the photograph, its petals pristine despite the fall. Amanda knelt down, her fingers brushing against the delicate petals. She knew it was a sign, a final gift from her father. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered, a small, bittersweet smile forming on her lips. As she placed the lily back on the altar, a sense of peace settled over her. For the first time since her father's death, the house felt warm again, alive with the love he had left behind. The redemption. That night, Amanda slept soundly for the first time in days. Her dreams were vivid yet soothing, filled with memories of her father's laughter and the warmth of his embrace. When she awoke the next morning, the house felt different. The oppressive heaviness that had haunted it was gone, replaced by a lightness that Amanda couldn't quite explain. Her siblings noticed it too, though none of them mentioned it aloud. As Amanda prepared for the day, she paused at the altar, lighting a fresh stick of incense. She didn't speak, but her thoughts were clear. Thank you for everything. Rest now. And though the room was empty, Amanda felt her father's presence one last time, a fleeting warmth, a gentle reminder that love transcends even death. Part 8. The haunting subsides. The days following Amanda's emotional plea at the family altar were filled with an eerie quiet that, for the first time, didn't feel suffocating. The oppressive heaviness that had hung over the house like a storm cloud was gone, replaced by a fragile calm. Amanda moved through the house with a newfound sense of purpose, her steps lighter, her shoulders less burdened. The shadows that once seemed to twist and stretch unnaturally were now just shadows, ordinary and unthreatening. The air, previously heavy and cold, was warm again, as though the house itself had sighed in relief. Yet the memories of the past days lingered, vivid and undeniable. Amanda knew the peace she felt was hard-won, and the echoes of her father's lingering spirit would stay with her forever. The quieting of whispers. On the first night after her heartfelt apology, Amanda stayed awake, listening. She half expected to hear the faint whispers that had tormented her since her father's passing. But the house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wood and the rhythmic ticking of the clock. For the first time, the silence didn't terrify her. The next morning, as Amanda prepared breakfast, she found herself glancing over her shoulder less often. The cold spots that had plagued her in the kitchen were gone, replaced by the steady warmth of sunlight streaming through the window. Even the family altar, once a source of dread, seemed inviting now. Her siblings noticed the change too. "The house feels different," James said one evening, as the family gathered in the living room. "Lighter," their younger sister Emily added, her voice soft, like it's breathing again. Amanda nodded but said nothing. She knew the difference wasn't just the absence of the eerie phenomena, it was the knowledge that her father was finally at peace, finding closure. Amanda spent much of her time tending to the altar. She replaced the offerings, daily fresh flowers, bowls of fruit, cups of tea, and lit incense every evening. Each gesture was small but meaningful, a way of honoring her father's memory and ensuring his spirit knew he was still loved. One afternoon, as she cleaned the altar, she found herself talking to him, her voice steady and calm. "I hope you're resting now," she said, arranging the flowers. "I hope you know how much we all miss you." The air around her was warm, comforting, and for a fleeting moment, Amanda felt as though he was there, listening. Her siblings had their own ways of finding closure. Emily took to cooking their father's favorite meals, filling the house with the comforting smells of their childhood. James spent hours in the garden, restoring the flower beds their father had once tended with so much care. Together, they reminisced, sharing stories and laughter that, for the first time since his death, didn't feel tinged with sadness. The final sign. It was on the 7th day after her father's passing that Amanda experienced the final sign. She was alone in the living room, lighting the evening incense, when she noticed something unusual. The photograph of her father, which she had cleaned and replaced on the altar, was tilted slightly to one side. Frowning, she reached out to straighten it. As her fingers brushed the frame, a faint warmth spread through her hand, as though the glass itself was alive. Amanda froze, her heart pounding. But the warmth wasn't frightening, it was gentle, comforting, the kind of warmth she remembered from her father's hugs. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. The candle flame flickered, but it didn't go out. Instead, it burned brighter for a moment, casting a soft golden glow across the room. Amanda felt a tear slip down her cheek as the warmth faded, leaving behind a profound sense of peace. She sat back on her heels, her hands clasped in her lap. She didn't need another sign. She knew he was gone, truly gone, and at peace. Forever changed. The family gathered one last time to hold a small ceremony, a way of saying goodbye not just to their father but to the strange, haunting journey they had all endured. They shared stories, laughter, and tears, their voices filling the house with life once more. Amanda stood by the altar, watching her siblings, a small smile playing on her lips. The house that had once felt like a prison now felt like a sanctuary, a place where her father's memory could live on without sorrow. That night, as the house settled into its quiet rhythms, Amanda felt the weight of the past weeks lift entirely. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her thoughts calm for the first time in what felt like an eternity. When she finally drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with warmth. She saw her father, standing in a field of golden light, his face free of pain, his smile as vibrant as she remembered. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. His expression said everything. "Thank you. I love you. Be at peace." Amanda woke with tears on her cheeks but a smile on her lips. She knew she would never forget what had happened, but she also knew she no longer needed to carry the weight of it. Her father was gone, but his love remained, woven into the fabric of their lives. A house of memories. Over time, the family returned to their routines. The house became a home again, filled with the everyday sounds of life, laughter, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of conversation. The eerie phenomenon never returned. The whispers, the cold spots, the flickering shadows all had vanished, leaving only the warmth of memory behind. Amanda continued to tend to the altar, lighting incense each evening and speaking to her father in quiet moments. She no longer sought signs or answers. She didn't need them. In the months that followed, the family grew closer, bound by the shared experience of both loss and redemption. They spoke often of their father, celebrating his life rather than mourning his death. And though they all carried the memory of those haunting days, they also carried the peace that had come after. For Amanda, the journey had been transformative. She had faced her fears, her guilt, and the unknown, and emerged stronger, more certain of the bonds that connected the living and the dead. Her father's spirit was gone, but his presence would always be a part of her, a gentle, guiding warmth that reminded her of the love they shared. And as the house settled into its quiet rhythms once more, Amanda knew it was not haunted by sorrow or regret, but by love. Part 9. A love beyond death. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the earth damp and glistening in the faint morning sunlight. Amanda stood alone by the family altar, the faint tendrils of incense curling into the air, carrying her prayers upward. The house was quiet now, not the eerie, suffocating silence that had once haunted its halls, but a peaceful stillness that felt like a soft embrace. It had been weeks since her father's funeral, weeks since the storm that had shaken their family to its core. Yet, in the stillness of this moment, Amanda felt the echoes of what had transpired. The strange, haunting days were behind her, but their significance remained, as vivid and raw as the first time she had heard his voice in the night. She touched the edge of her father's photograph, tracing the outline of his smiling face. He looked so alive, so full of warmth, that it was hard to believe such a vibrant presence could ever fade. But he hadn't faded, Amanda realized, not truly. Her father's love had transcended even death, breaking the boundaries between their worlds to ensure she and her siblings knew the depths of his devotion. The weight of reflection. Amanda took a deep breath and sank onto the floor before the altar, her knees pressing into the worn wooden planks. Her mind replayed the events that had unfolded since her father's passing, each memory sharper than the last. The whispers, the cold spots, the eerie shadows that had seemed alive, all of it had terrified her. But now, as she looked back, she saw the truth behind the fear. Her father's spirit hadn't lingered out of malice. The unsettling phenomena hadn't been a punishment or an attempt to harm. They were desperate acts of love, of longing, of a man who had given everything for his family and couldn't bear to leave without saying goodbye. Amanda closed her eyes, her heart heavy with both sorrow and gratitude. She thought of the moments that had terrified her most: the crack in the earth at his funeral, the flickering flames, the whispered plea in the night. Each one had carried the same message, though she hadn't seen it at the time. I'm still here. I'm with you. The unseen bonds. Growing up, Amanda had always known her father's love. It was in the way he worked tirelessly to provide for them, the way he gave up little luxuries to make sure his children never went without. But it wasn't until after his death that she truly understood the lengths he had gone to for their happiness. He had sacrificed his health, refusing treatment for his illness to save them from financial strain. Even in his final moments, he had been thinking of them, worrying about how they would carry on without him. Amanda's throat tightened as she remembered the medium's words: love can be a chain as much as it is a comfort. Her father's love had been his strength in life, but it had also been his burden in death. He had stayed because he couldn't let go, because he needed to know they would be okay. And in the end, he had found peace, not through grand gestures or supernatural events, but through the simple, heartfelt words of his daughter. The signs of love. As Amanda opened her eyes, she felt a soft breeze pass through the room, carrying the faint scent of her father's cologne. It wasn't cold or eerie, it was warm, comforting, like a gentle reminder that he was still watching over them. She smiled faintly, her hand brushing against the small white lily she had placed on the altar the night before. The flower was fresh and untouched, its petals pristine, despite the passing time. To Amanda, it was another sign. Her father's presence wasn't confined to whispers or flickering lights. It was in the small, quiet moments: the sunlight streaming through the windows, the warmth that filled the house, the sense of peace that had settled over their family. The family's healing. Her siblings had noticed it too. James, who had spent weeks consumed by guilt over not doing more for their father, had finally begun to let go. Amanda often found him in the garden, tending to the flowers their father had planted years ago. His quiet labor was his way of staying connected, of honoring the man who had taught him the value of hard work. Emily, the youngest, had started filling the house with music again. Her soft singing, accompanied by the gentle notes of the old piano, brought life back into the home. It was a far cry from the hushed whispers of fear that had once dominated their days. They didn't talk about the haunting much anymore. When they did, it was with a mixture of reverence and wonder, a shared understanding that their father's spirit had lingered not out of anger, but out of love. He just wanted to make sure we were okay, Emily had said one evening, her voice soft but steady. Amanda had nodded, her heart swelling with pride for the man who had given them everything, even in death. A daughter's realization. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Amanda returned to the altar one last time. She lit a fresh stick of incense, watching as the smoke curled upward in graceful spirals. "Hi, Dad," she said softly, her voice steady but filled with emotion. The room was quiet, but Amanda felt no fear. She felt only love. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened," she continued. "About the whispers, the cold, the way you stayed with us, even when you didn't have to. I think I understand now." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "You weren't trying to scare me. You weren't angry. You just wanted us to know how much you loved us, how much we meant to you." She paused, the words catching in her throat. "And I hope you know how much we loved you too. How much we still love you. The candle flame flickered softly, its warm glow bathing the room in light. Amanda smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. Thank you for everything, Dad, she whispered. For your sacrifices, for your love, for staying with us even when it was hard. But you don't have to worry anymore. We're okay. I promise. The air around her seemed to shift, wrapping her in a gentle warmth that felt like an embrace. Amanda closed her eyes, letting the sensation wash over her. When she opened them, the room was still, the candle burning steadily. The shadows in the corners were just shadows, ordinary and unthreatening. And Amanda knew, without a doubt, that her father was at peace, a love that endures. In the days that followed, Amanda carried the lessons of her father's love with her. She saw it in the small acts of kindness she shared with her siblings, in the memories they kept alive through stories and laughter. Her father's presence wasn't something she sought anymore. It was something she carried with her, woven into the fabric of her being. Love, Amanda realized, wasn't confined by life or death. It endured, stretching across the boundaries of time and space, binding them together in ways that could never be broken. Her father's love had transcended death, not as a haunting, but as a reminder of the unbreakable bonds they shared. And as Amanda stood by the altar one last time, lighting a candle in his honor, she felt at peace, knowing that love like his never truly fades,